Hello to the internet and welcome to episode 6 of Last Week in Free Speech. I'm Trevor and I'm joined as always by my friend Victor, but not as always, we have a special guest. The president of the Atheist Alliance of America, Mr. Aron Ra, has joined us and has chosen our topic. So, Aron, what is the topic and why do you think it's important?
The issue with climate change is people have this strange belief that they don't have any accountability for anything that they do. And so they can't be responsible for changes that they make to the environment. But rational people understand that the way that our atmosphere came about to begin with was by microbes releasing oxygen as a byproduct. Anaerobic bacteria, like cyanobacteria, was releasing oxygen into the atmosphere over 1 billion years or so. And while you might think that there's a hell of a lot of them doing that, and they were doing that for a hell of a long time, this is true. But we have automobiles that can consume as much oxygen in minutes as the average human can breathe in 4 days. We have vehicles in industry. We have millions and millions of cars around the world. We have industry that are dramatically changing, systematically, constantly, methodically. They're changing the atmospheric content at literally an industrial rate. So we are exceeding dramatically what these microbes were able to do at their very, very slow pace. And so it's foolish to think that, like with oil, for example, when you talk about, people say that we can't run out of oil. Oil is an inexhaustible resource. But we don't have a tap into a supernatural petroleum line on any finite planet. This planet's just slightly less than 8,000 miles across. There's only so much anything that you can put in it. It is obviously finite by definition. Everything that is here, there's only a finite amount of it. So the more you use, the less you have left. I don't understand how people's math can't work that out. And the more oxygen you consume, the more CO2 you put into the atmosphere, the more trees and vegetation that you cut down and pave over, because these are the things that we're putting oxygen back into the atmosphere, the more you destroy the ecosystem that replenishes the oxygen, and the more you replace that with methane-producing cattle, the more you add to the problem. And it's beyond foolish to pretend that there was never a problem to begin with, or that we couldn't do anything about that, one way or another.
Okay. I will just start by saying that I'm not a scientist, and I'm not a climate scientist. But I do accept the mainstream science behind anthropogenic climate change. I do accept that most scientists say that climate change is real and that humans play a role in that industrialization has played a role in climate change. And I accept that we do need to reduce our CO2 emissions. I think there are a bunch of ways that we can go about that. I think that we've seen positive developments over the past decade or so. For example, natural gas is significantly less carbon intensive than oil. I believe it has roughly half the carbon emissions as oil or coal. So I think that hydraulic fracturing I think is good. I think natural gas is a good transition fuel as we try to move to a greener economy. I think nuclear energy is useful, in combating the effects of climate change. Nuclear energy is very clean. So I think that there's a lot that can be done to address climate change. I'm not averse to a carbon tax, but so long as the carbon tax is rebated back to the people, so the economy continues to grow. So you have a carbon tax, and then that the revenue generated from the carbon tax could be rebated back to people's tax returns. And then we could have industries that export to countries that emit a lot could receive a refund on their carbon tax, so they remain competitive. And exports from countries which pollute a lot, which emit a lot of carbon, could be taxed based on how much carbon was used to produce the product. So, for example, if some sort of product from China has a certain amount of silicon in it, there would be some sort of formula where we calculate how much carbon emissions is used to produce silicon, and then we could tax those products based on how much carbon emissions were used to produce them. So that's something I'd be sympathetic to. Ms. Aron talked about peak oil briefly, and again, I'm not an expert on the subject, but I believe that there was a British environmentalist named George Monbiot, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, who said he was wrong about peak oil. He said that actually we're not going to run out of fossil fuels at any point in the foreseeable future. Obviously, that burning a lot of fossil fuels has deleterious effects on the environment. But he wrote an article that said I was wrong about peak oil. There was enough oil to fry us all, or something like that. So I'm not an expert on the merits of that, but as I understand it, there have been some disputes about the actual merits of peak oil, or the notion that running out of fossil fuels is imminent. But I'm open to being disproven on that. I'm not infallible. Yeah, that's my thoughts on that in a nutshell, for the time being at least.
All right. Well, I'd like to start by talking about the peak oil. My understanding of this is that there is indeed enough oil to last quite a long time, but only if you start burning oil that's harder to get, such as shale, or you mentioned fracking. I think the problem with fracking is that it pollutes the groundwater, and so I think it's too high a price to pay for oil. And if you restrict yourself to the easy to get oil, if you don't do things like build giant undersea complexes that are so far down that they'll never be able to be repaired, under those circumstances, we will run out of oil relatively quickly. As for the carbon tax, I indeed support a carbon tax, and would like to add that I think the revenue from such a tax should be added to the revenue from the gas tax, which is currently in crisis, to help repair infrastructure and also to improve it, and improve particularly the environmental properties of our infrastructure. The former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis and his organization, the Democracy in Europe movement, have been creating rather specific plans for what he calls a Green New Deal, whereby lots of people would be employed by the government to build infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, that would be at least closer to carbon neutral and also just generally more environmentally friendly. And I think that would be beneficial for both the economy and the environment. I think that's what I want to begin with. So, Aron, do you have any comments?
Well, I want to add that when we're talking about a carbon tax, we're still talking about working with fossil fuels. And we need to run, not walk, away from fossil fuels. And I mean absolutely. Drop it like a stone. We know that jets are a very efficient way of traveling, and they don't have an alternative that they can use. So it only makes sense, if we're going to maintain jets at all, that we not use the only fuel they can use for vehicles that can use other things. For whatever ridiculous reason, the United States still hasn't invested in a mass transit system. I mean, if you've ever been to Europe, I mean, their trains are all over the place, and they're wonderfully efficient, and you don't need a car in Europe, which is brilliant. But here in the United States, you do, because we don't have a mass transit system to speak of. Now, we've had people that have been very dramatic, progressive humanitarians who create great technologies that can replace everything that we're using right now. And when Elon Musk surrendered the patents for his Tesla, and we've got a number of different electric car companies that are making performance, high-speed electric cars that run various different types of batteries that require different materials to make them. So we can immediately retool every factory in the country so that all domestic-made American cars could, by next year, by all the 2018 cars, they could all of them be emission-free. Not hybrid, emission-free. And they would have, get this, more torque and more horsepower and be completely green. And if you were to put a 300 horsepower electric motor in the front of a truck and put another 300 horsepower electric motor in the back of a truck, and you build your truck this way, you've got a 700 horsepower all-wheel drive vehicle. Now, if you hand that to people that you're used to paying, for $3 a gallon four-wheel drives that they have now, if they get even that much, let them experiment with this, where all they have to do is plug into the house. And the house, by the way, is running on a Tesla battery and solar panels and wind generators. We don't even need a main grid anymore. And the main grid can be replaced with a combination of solar, like they're doing in Las Vegas right now. When they started running it low on the water at Hoover Dam, they built this massive electrical station so that they can run Las Vegas off of literally solar power for completely free. But then you've also got tidal generators, and then we've got wind farms that we can use, and we can use a wonderful mix of all of these so that we don't have to do anything with the fossil fuels anymore. We can completely replace them individually or independently, having homes generate all of their own power, and the homes that are running on completely green with the wind generators and the solar panel combination, they actually generate more energy than they use and can turn that back into the grid so that they actually make money from the power companies, and this is the rest of this is dispersed to industry. So that's the way that we need to be going.
Yeah, I agree with most of those statements. Ideally, yes, we do need to move away from fossil fuels. However, if we look at all energy production in the world right now, it is still like 87% produced by fossil fuels. Even in the most progressive countries in Europe, in Scandinavia, you still have a very, very sizable portion of those countries who get their energy production from fossil fuels, from gas, particularly from natural gas. So I don't think it's entirely realistic to say we can 100% get off fossil fuels in the immediate future. Obviously, we should move away from them, and I don't have a problem with that. I don't think a big country like the United States or a country like a China or an India is ever going to 100% be off fossil fuels. That doesn't strike me as realistic. I think we can move away from that direction, though. I think one thing we definitely need to look into is nuclear power. Nuclear power is pretty safe. Actually, there was an analysis by Dr. James Konka, a geochemist, which actually found that nuclear power has the smallest death print. That it actually kills the least people of all other sources of power. When you take into account, I guess people working at power plants, accidents, all of that, nuclear power actually is the least harmful. So I think nuclear power is something we need to look into. It has very low carbon emissions. I think almost none, actually, or at least comparable with renewables. So that's something we need to look into. With respect to water pollution that comes from fracking, which Trevor mentioned, I believe that, though again not an expert on the subject, I'm pretty certain that has been overstated. There was an analysis by the EPA which looked at fracking wells in North Dakota, which only found water contamination in, I believe, 3% of wells. That's not really that high enough of a number to warrant alarm. I think natural gas proliferation is something that is a positive, because although natural gas is a fossil fuel, it obviously is less harmful than conventional oil and much less carbon intensive than coal. So I think we should embrace natural gas. I think natural gas is a good transition fuel as we try to move to a cleaner, less carbon intensive economy. So yes, we need to move away from fossil fuels, but it's not realistic to say that we're going to get there overnight, I would say.
So I think I would like to start with natural gas, because my understanding is that in order to mine natural gas, you need to mine, all of the various other products that you find in fossil fuels when they're in the ground as well. And so you can't really just switch to natural gas, because you'll have all these leftover products that nobody will use. As for nuclear power, I agree, especially because there are new designs for nuclear reactors that would essentially never melt down. And in fact, coal, perhaps within the context of this, comparing to coal isn't the best, but nuclear reactors actually release less radiation into the environment than coal does, partly because you need so much fewer of them. I also want to talk about mass transit. I do believe that we need a reliable mass transit system. Nowadays especially, you could power electric trains using solar panels right next to them. But as for having solar panels on houses and buildings, I think that's also a good idea. But with traditional solar panels anyway, actually there are actually some newer technologies that are quite promising in this regard. But with standard silicon wafer photovoltaic cells, there basically isn't enough silicon or at least not enough easy to get silicon to put those everywhere. As I say, though, there are some newer technologies that can help solve that problem. One of the most basic being to just use mirrors to actually focus the sun into a photovoltaic cell. As for electric cars, I'd like to point out something, Aron, that you essentially eventually pointed out anyway, but that is just transferring immediately to electric cars would only help so much because so much of our electric power still comes from fossil fuels. I believe roughly 50% of electrical power in the United States still comes from coal, which is even worse than the oil burned by cars. However, you did go on to say, or talk about changing the power grid. That would, of course, solve the problem. Finally, to revisit fracking, I rather think 3% of wells is too much, especially because you'd have to eventually build these things everywhere if you didn't want to run out of oil. Those are my comments.
All right. Well, I don't like the having to switch to natural gas, which is extremely volatile, is as a transition when no transition is necessary. It really isn't. But the problem that you get with LP gas, and I've had some personal upfront experience with this, is that the way that it goes off, you can fill up a gas tank at a gas station of regular unleaded gasoline, and you can smoke a cigarette while you're doing it. But if you do that with propane, then you're going to blow up a city block. And I've seen a city block explode, the whole block. I used to have propane needs. I used to have to fill propane regularly, and I show up to the depot to get it, and the whole block is gone. It was a divot, a huge hole in the ground. And so, as I said, there's no need to do the transition. We have the technology already available. We can switch to all electric right now. And the only reason that we don't is because people are so conservative and reserved. They tried to set up a solar farm here in Texas where all they wanted to do was use all of this acreage that's just baking hot with none of that energy going anywhere. Because we can have 115-degree summers here, so may as well take advantage of that. Lay out all these solar panels and generate the energy from that. However, the town that owned that land voted against it on the excuse that they thought that it would drain the sun. That's why we don't make any progress, because we don't have people putting thought into what they're doing, and because they're completely beholden to the temporary profits of the oil industry. That ultimately is the big damn deal. People that can't see the future beyond the next fiscal quarter, that's the primary problem.
Okay, a couple of points on it. Well, firstly, one thing I guess I didn't comment on earlier was this issue of mass transit. I guess the reason why we don't have a type of intercity mass transit that we have in the United States that they have in Europe is the same reason they also don't have one in Australia or don't have one in Canada. We just have different, less densely populated countries. We're more spread out. I mean, within many of our big cities, particularly in the Northeast, the densely populated cities like New York City, Boston, you don't really need a car. That's just the way those cities are planned out. It's just urban planning. Same thing in San Francisco. So I think that's just simply a matter of geography more so than anything else. Right now, there's an effort to build a train in California to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And the original plan was like 2.5 hours, but because of different challenges, the geography in California, logistical challenges in actually building the train, it kept getting pushed back more and more, and it's going over and over budget. So I'm not, of course, averse to mass transit when it's economical and when it makes sense. What I'm not for is the government subsidizing massive boondoggles which lose money. I just don't think that's a very wise use of investment. Going back to the point on natural gas, I don't know if Aron is saying that he says we have the technology to go electric, go solar. I mean, I'm not disputing that the technology is out there, and it is a good thing, and we should definitely utilize it. However, I don't know if he's saying that we can go 100% renewables tomorrow. No country in the world that I know of does that right now. I certainly don't think that's feasible for a country of 310 million people like the United States. So I'm not averse to them, right? Not at all. But the reality is very large portion of our energy sector is based in fossil fuels. And while that's not a good thing, I think we should try to make the best of that for the time being, try to reduce our carbon footprint with fossil fuels to the best of our ability. And with respect to the fracking water pollution, Trevor suggesting that 3% is too much. Well, with heart surgeries, something like 10% result in a fatality, yet we don't stop performing heart surgeries. I think we can utilize regulations and try to improve the technology, try to innovate the technology to reduce the instances of hydraulic fracturing resulting in water contamination. But I don't think 3% is a number which is high enough to say that we should just abandon the technology or abandon the processes altogether, especially when you consider the amount of economic growth, the amount of revitalization that happens in communities where fracking is prevalent. I mean, you just look at North Dakota, you look at these communities in North Dakota, Williston, you look at all the growth that's going on there. You look at all the people from all across the country who are moving there for these jobs in the mining industry. You look at all the businesses that are opening up. So, I mean, there's a lot of economic growth potential, and there's a lot of potential for the United States to be a real energy power, in the short term, to combat the influence of a lot of these countries that really aren't very democratic, Saudi Arabia, Russia, all these countries. So I think that we should take advantage of our gas reserves in the meantime, for the time being, and of course, gradually try to wean our way off of fossil fuels as well. But I don't think the two are entirely contradictory.
I think I'd like to start with the heart surgery analogy, because when you get heart surgery, it's because you don't have any other options. As Aron's been pointing out, we do have options besides fracking. And also, if heart surgery results in a fatality, it's one person that dies. If you contaminate the groundwater for a village or a town, you end up decreasing the quality of the life in that entire village and town. As for whether or not the government should step in and take projects that are likely to lose money, like building a mass transit system, I'd argue that this is what the government is for. Or at least one of the things that the government is for is that it can make financial decisions that would not be profitable in the market. And further, I think if we want to transition quickly to fossil fuels, it's not feasible to attempt to let the market do it. But I think with enough government intervention, it would be feasible to do. And I think this goes back to what Aron said, that the reason we can't make progress is because this sector of the economy has become so market-driven and short-term market-driven at that nobody sees any advantage in improving it.
All right, well, I want to suggest that what you're talking about, it may not be possible to do this overnight. Well, nothing ever happens overnight, does it? But let's say that we waste no time and do this as absolutely fast as we possibly can, in a moment of desperation, so that we have all of our factories, all of our automotive manufacturers take advantage of the fact we have this technology made freely available, the patents open. We have engineers in this country that are still designing internal combustion engines to be used 5 years from now. Why they're more efficient than the internal combustion engines we're using now. But why are we still designing a technology for use 5 years from now when there should not be any internal combustion engines 5 years from now? We should be retooling immediately. We should have begun retooling as soon as that technology became available so that every single 2018 car could be emission-free. Why are we not doing that? We're not doing that because people can't wean themselves off that teat, right? We don't need government subsidies to make this change to completely clean and completely green, right? And the other analogy that was brought up, so 10% of heart patients result in fatalities, and 90% of heart patients who don't get the surgery end up dead anyway. So they have a reason why they have to do this. We're the case of, if we don't get away from fossil fuels very quickly, we are going to have a chronic, lethal problem. It needs to be addressed quickly, immediately, with urgency, not incrementally, absolutely immediately now.
I guess I would just make a couple points. I think that the state, we can implement a carbon tax and then allow the market to respond to incentives. That way, private industry can find the way to reduce their carbon footprint however they see fit. And then that would result in moving away from the pollutants that indeed are responsible for significant amounts of CO2 emissions. You say we need to get away from it now. Okay, I agree, that is ideal, but there's no country in the world that I know of that is 100% weaned off of fossil fuels. If we look at even countries in Europe, Western Europe, and countries in Scandinavia, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, even those countries still use a significant amount of fossil fuels. Fossil fuel use isn't non-existent in those countries. So it's just not practical at this time to say that we're going to get off it now. So it is an incremental process. That just is the simple reality, whether or not we like it. So with regards to fracking is another result in the proliferation of natural gas, which of course is less carbon intensive than what we use now. I think we should try to get off coal, and we should try to see to it that those coal miners can find more productive work, possibly work in the fracking fields. So is fracking necessary? I mean, it depends on how you define necessary. I think fracking is a very valuable tool in moving away from the very dirty, polluting, carbon-intensive fuels that we use now in the United States, and then trying to move towards renewables. Another thing that we haven't talked about that much is nuclear power, which is very low in carbon emissions, and I think that's also something that we need to move towards. I think we need to be building more nuclear power plants, like China's doing, like India's doing, so that way we can emit power very efficiently, but also have a low carbon footprint. I also think something that we need to look into is clean coal technology. And I think that having a carbon tax, which gets rebated back to the people, can result in these industries investing in that technology and how they see fit so they can reduce their carbon footprint. So I think we can allow the state to give the market incentives to move away from carbon-intensive energy sources. I think that's the way forward as I see it.
All right, well, I think I'd just like to point out that the reason even progressive countries in Europe haven't gone all out to remove carbon emissions is because the same market forces that predominate here predominate there, albeit somewhat less. But I would like to point out that if you can take coal miners and put them into the fracking business, which isn't clear, by the way, because fracking is a lot less labor intensive than coal mining, you could also send them to build solar plants or carbon sequestration facilities or indeed nuclear plants, which I do believe in nuclear power. As to how bad the problem of climate change is, I think it's clear that it's very bad if certain types of countermeasures are not employed. But I would like to point out that it's been proposed, most famously by Peter Mervold, one of the founders of Microsoft, who runs a think tank that does this sort of thing, that in fact, if we attempt to engineer the atmosphere, we could actually counteract global warming that way, even if we continue on our same course for a while. Finally, Victor, I believe you supported clean coal and moving away from coal. Could you say which of those you would say is your priority?
I don't know which specifically is my priority. I guess my priority is just finding a way to reduce our carbon footprint. So moving away from conventional coal. That can mean clean coal, and that can mean other sources of energy production as well, like natural gas, nuclear, as well as renewables. So I guess when I say moving away from coal, I mean moving away from conventional coal proliferation as it is widely understood.
When I say that we need to be doing this urgently and immediately, we are behind other countries that are also moving in that direction, but they're actually moving in that direction. We're moving in the opposite direction currently. And while nobody has gotten 100% green, they're working toward that. And we could work toward that. And we actually are going the opposite direction as fast as we can. This is dangerous and beyond dangerous. It's, for lack of a better word or more appropriate descriptive, this is stupid to go the direction that we're going. We have the ability to go completely green. And when you say, the difference between doing it urgently and doing it incrementally, if we were to build every car electric in 2018, that would not eliminate any of the gasoline cars that we already have. When you talk about Norway, for example, I was in Norway a few months ago, and they have many different electric cars that are using various different types of batteries. So some of the arguments that I've heard petroleum people try to use, well, we could never make enough batteries because there's not enough lithium in the world. Well, there's multiple different types that can be used for this. And then, of course, replacing with the mass transit system. Well, one of the things that they have is that petrol is 15 kroners a liter, or I think is actually higher than that now. Whereas we are complacent because we've kept our gas prices down so low, lower than anybody else gets it, that we don't realize there's even a problem. So when a reaction to the petroleum issue comes up, we suddenly remarket 700 horsepower cars. This is our response to this? To reinvent the muscle cars of the 1960s, except with twice as much power as they used to have. And they got a little bit better gas mileage than those the older cars did, but still 700 horsepower. That you're getting 3.5 miles a gallon on that thing. So this is not the direction we need to be going. We are not being intelligent about this, and especially when you think about the fact that electric cars actually have more horsepower and more torque right off the line. So everything that the performance drivers should want, they can get in an electric car.
What I would say to that is, firstly, you brought up gas prices in Europe, particularly in Norway, and they are significantly high, much higher than we have in the United States. I think one thing that really would be a tough sell to most people, to your typical middle-class American voters, that you want their gas prices to be $12 a gallon. Now, I agree that fuel prices should rise over time. That is something that is important to wean our way off of fossil fuels, and to reduce our carbon footprint. But telling your middle class family in Iowa that they need to pay $13 an hour.
I'm not saying that.
Okay, I don't mean to mischaracterize what you're saying. That was not my intention, but it's not realistic to go that direction. So I think we can reduce our carbon footprint. And I think we can do it through a variety of means. You say we're moving in the opposite direction. I haven't looked at the data specifically, but I do know that natural gas is less carbon intensive than coal. I know coal plants have been closing across the country.
Except with Trump. Remember that Trump now wants to reopen coal plants. He wants to invest more heavily in coal and petroleum and fracking.
Yes, I think with regard to fracking, though, I think fracking can help us move away from coal because fracking is cheaper and it's more market efficient than coal. So I think fracking can naturally put coal out of business through pure market forces alone. I think in addition to that, we can add that carbon tax, and then which we can give back to the people in the form of dividends, which can encourage economic growth. And then on top of that, to ensure American competitiveness against countries like China and India, we can tax imports from China and India based on the carbon intensiveness of those products. So I think we can move away from carbon emissions. I think we will move away from it gradually. I'm not entirely certain that even with Trump that we're moving 100% in the opposite direction. I have my differences with many of Trump's policies. But I think that there is a role for fracking in actually combating climate change. And another thing I would point out is I think that pipelines, which Trump has approved, which the Obama administration did not approve, I think pipelines actually do have a role in combating environmental degradation or the risks of environmental degradation caused by petroleum proliferation. We look at the alternatives, which are rail, primarily it's rail. That's how 90% of oil is transported in North America, I believe. That is much more risky than a pipeline.
I gotta contest you there.
Okay.
I've been to Standing Rock, and I've seen the figures, and I've interviewed the Lakota Sioux about the pipelines and everything, and seen government sites explaining this. Absolutely every pipeline leaks. When I was at Standing Rock in October, there were over 100 pipelines leaking at that moment. One of them caught fire, and they wouldn't allow even drones to fly over it because they were trying to keep it hushed down. Another one had put 30,000 gallons of raw gasoline into an aquifer feeding 60,000 people. And another one was unresolved in December. They said they weren't going to even begin to try to address it until January for fiscal reasons, was spewing raw gasoline into just out onto the open ground in a public park. I mean, raw gasoline, just pouring it. Now, I'm trying to imagine something about the gauge of a fire hose dumping raw gasoline continuously for a number of weeks before they can come up with a fiscal excuse to justify the cost necessary to shut that down. These are not just one-off occasions. This is absolutely every single pipeline leaks. Now, you've got a point when you're talking about the rail or the trucks. When on the odd occasion, one of these might wreck, and you might have the contents of that container that might spill on the odd occasion that one of them wrecks. But this is every pipeline leaks. And when they do, they all leak way beyond the container capacity of any of those rail or trucks.
Well, to be candid, I haven't heard that before. It has been my understanding that rail is more hazardous than pipelines. I do know that rail, as far as I'm aware, there haven't been any pipeline leaks which have caused human fatalities directly. Or if there haven't been any mass casualty incidents, as we saw with that train derailment in Quebec in 2013, where 40 people were killed. So we do know that transporting by train is quite hazardous when there is a derailment, and it can result in combustion. It is quite hazardous. With respect to everything you told me about how every pipeline leaks, I have not heard that specific statistic before. I'll have to look into that more. But I'm open to being convinced that is the case. But rail is definitely a very hazardous way of transporting oil, and it's also much more expensive at that, so it's just not economical. So if pipelines are leaking all the time, we should definitely address that, and there should be more regulation to combat leaks. That's something that we don't want. But a pipeline is a very economical means of transporting oil and gas.
Another thing that needs to be brought up about the specific pipeline that we're talking about, got the most attention right now, is one that is not even going to do anything for the gas prices of Americans. It's not going to create jobs for Americans. It's not even going to provide oil for Americans. This oil is going to be refined in China. So it is only going to further enrich the already very rich. When Obama shut this down, he was invested in it. Hillary was invested in it. Goldman Sachs, Wells Fargo, every financial organization that was accused of being part of the oligarchy in charge of the United States was invested in that pipeline. And this was the moment that we saw where that the corporations are going to do what they want to do, and it no longer matters what we, the people, say about that. I was very surprised that Obama came out of the pocket of the oligarchy and said, no, we're not going to do this, and shut it down. But Trump has at minimum $500,000 in this, if not a full million, which was reported by the agencies themselves, that he's invested at least $500,000, if not $1 million, into this pipeline. And so he has no idea about global climate change or that humans are the cause of it. So the worst that he will say is that, well, they have an impact. No, we are it. It's anthropogenic climate change. And so he went ahead and did it anyway. And this is not just for that reason, but also because years earlier he said that he was against Native Americans having reservation lands. He wanted to take their lands and develop them, and that they didn't have a right to those lands because, as he said in a Senate hearing, they don't look like Indians to me. So you've got a whole bunch of problems piled in there.
I guess my main point of contention would be with the assertion that the construction of these pipelines won't create any jobs for Americans. That does seem a bit counterintuitive, right? Constructing something does require manpower and require labor.
So but once it's online, that's it.
Okay, well, at the very least, so we get some sort of employment, at the very least in the short term, and then we need people to maintain those pipelines. So
there's another problem, a bigger problem, that nobody's talking about yet. It's looming, and I don't know how people don't see it coming. But you're talking about changing the structure in a market economy that isn't going to exist in another decade. Because we've already got where we have some 1,800 electric cars that are driving themselves in California. And now Uber and Lyft want to replace their cars with automated cars so that they no longer have Uber drivers, Lyft drivers, taxi drivers will be replaced by automated vehicles. You've now had the first fully automated Volvo semi-truck deliver an order of Budweiser on its own. So if my information is correct, this is what I'm reading. From what I've read recently, we're looking at an automated trucking industry, which is the biggest industry we have as far as the most jobs that this country has are invested in the trucking industry. And if you replace that with automated trucking, then what you've got is where Donald Trump again got this company to remain on American soil. Well, fine, the company's going to stay there, but it's going to be occupied by robots. It's completely automated. There's not going to be any people working those jobs. Our entire economy is going to have to dramatically shift over.
I agree with the point about automation, but you could say that about any sort of industry. We are moving away from an economy that is, that's manufacturing driven. So automation affects all sorts of industries. I just still don't see how that's really an argument against how construction of pipelines, how the energy industry creates jobs in the short term. Perhaps a decade from now, 15, 20 years from now, those jobs will be taken away by automation. That I agree, that's the way our economy is going, but you can say that about all sorts of industries. So I don't really think that the automation argument is an argument against the boons that it can have for local communities in the short term, put people to work, and then as automation happens, those jobs will go away and they can find other forms of work.
What if you generate jobs by building solar panels and wind generators?
That's fine too. Yeah.
And these are for the individual houses. So now we have an actual means of producing real jobs that works in both economies and is completely green, and we don't have to do any kind of transition, and we don't have to have the pipelines.
So you're suggesting putting people to work in constructing solar panels for houses?
Yeah, and wind generators. And tidal generators, because that's another one that was just invented, so this is why you don't see it in Europe much yet.
I hadn't. That is a very intriguing proposal. I hadn't even thought about that, to be candid. I'd have to look. I would have to see some sort of analysis on the cost effectiveness of that. That's not something I'd be entirely averse to. It just does seem it seems a little bit impractical to put people to work to put, solar panels on the homes of every house in the country.
Yeah, that was suggested here in Texas, and again, Texas voted it down. When it was first promoted that we could replace the old-fashioned shingles on our roofs with solar panels. That was voted down. It was actually made illegal in some areas in Texas to put solar panels on suburban homes. They tried to, I don't remember what the particulars of this case were, but if I remember correctly, that's what it was. They didn't want people to be able to solarize their houses. They wanted them to be addicted to the main grid that we've been producing all this time, where Texas got its economy from. It's oil-based.
Mm-hmm. Well, I, of course, am not averse to solar power, and I think any sort of law which prohibits people from putting solar power on their roofs is absolutely ridiculous. I guess one point I forgot to mention a moment ago is the trouble I do see with solar panels is that they're based on whether or not the sun is out, and I think there needs to be some sort of mechanism for storing the power long term. There's all sorts
There is. That's the battery that we were talking about. Elon Musk built a battery. It's about 4 foot by 3 foot, if I remember correctly, and it mounts in the house, and it stores the power from the solar and from the wind, so that when either one goes out, it doesn't matter. You can still run your house off it.
Yeah, I don't have a problem with that in that case. Again, I just would reiterate, I don't think it's entirely realistic to get off coal energy tomorrow. You talked about energy in Texas. Texas, of course, is economically one of the best states in the country. Very low unemployment. There's a lot of economic growth there because of that energy boom. So I think that I wouldn't disparage it too much. I don't think we should be disparaging solar power either. But I think that there is a place for both. I think we can move in the direction of solar power and wind power and nuclear power. I don't think that massive subsidies is necessarily the way to go. I think that could result in cronyism. I think, as we have seen with Obama with Solyndra. So I think there are different signaling mechanisms that we can use to have private industry reduce their carbon footprint and become more efficient. I guess those are my thoughts.
All right.
And I don't have a problem with being more efficient. It's just that if we look at things as being, we can take our time and we can do this incrementally. Incrementally is all you can do, no matter how urgently you do it. So as I said, if you make every car electric in 2018, you still have a whole lot of other cars that are still using fossil fuels, and you will have for a number of years. And when you start building your offshore generators and your solar panels and your wind generators, you can build them as expediently as you want to. You're still going to have some dependence in the interim. The problem is that people were talking about remaining dependent as long as they can, and they want to stretch the interim beyond what it necessarily needs to be.
All right. Well, I'd like to begin by talking about putting people to work to build various green technologies. As I pointed out earlier, that there are actually very specific proposals in place to do this in Europe by the Democracy in Europe movement, which is led by Yanis Varoufakis. So if, Victor, you want to see anything about the feasibility of things like this, I'd recommend looking into the Democracy in Europe movement proposals. As for automation, I would just like to point out that the issue of automation is separable from the issue of greenhouse gases. It's entirely possible to have automated cars that are electric. Finally, with respect to us moving in the opposite direction from green technology, I would agree with this statement. I think what our government should be doing under these circumstances is creating incentives against further use of fossil fuels. But by the pipeline directly and the support for fracking indirectly, I don't think that's what they're doing. I think the government is in fact creating more incentives to use fossil fuels, which is exactly the opposite of what we need. Now, in the case of fracking, of course, it wasn't invented by the government, but I think it should be regulated for, among other reasons, because it does incentivize further use of fossil fuels. And anyway, we're running out of time, so it's time for final comments.
I look to a future that we have to think we want to hold off on the fossil fuels that we have because there are still capacities of making plastics and perhaps other technologies that haven't been invented yet that can still use these resources if we leave them in the ground so that they exist for future generations. And sadly, in my state in particular, where everybody is an end times dominionist, we have throughout every level of government here, people are thinking that these are the end days and that we don't have to prepare for a future because we literally don't have one. And so we're going to live like there's no tomorrow. And this is, to say the least, grossly irresponsible and completely unrealistic.
Okay, I guess my final thoughts are that we do need to care about the environment. We do need to reduce our carbon footprint. Human climate change is real. Its effects can be observed around the world. I think that we do also need to look at our economy. We need to look at jobs. We need to try to be competitive globally, especially when we look at other countries around the world. When we look at China, when we look at India, we look at Brazil, we look at Russia, we look at these big countries, these big economies, which pollute at enormous rates. We need to be competitive compared to those countries. So I would say we can have a tax on carbon emissions, which gets credited back to the people, so we put more money in people's pockets so they can go spend. Industries can naturally reduce their carbon footprint. They can invest in technologies and fuels that are less carbon intensive. And we can tax imports from countries that do pollute at enormous rates. I mean, China opens something like one coal plant a week. That's something that we need to address. No matter how much we do to try to reduce carbon emissions here, if China doesn't halt its pollution, then it really won't make any difference. So that's something that really needs to be addressed. I think that's just as critical as anything, is holding these developing nations accountable. So I'd say tax imports from China that are based on the carbon level of those products, and then move away from carbon emissions within this country in a way that encourages growth, economic growth, and lets us create jobs and have a powerful economy.
I would argue that the underlying problem that we're facing is a problem of incentives. That for individuals in the short term, it's in their interest to continue to pollute. And it's been said once that if we burn all of the hard to get oil, we'll never stop burning oil, and it will be really bad. And I think there's something to that. I think what we have to do is we have to allow the public, the governments, to come in and to alter the incentives. Carbon tax is one way, but I think we need to do other things. I think we need to much more heavily regulate fracking. I think the government also has a role in building various kinds of infrastructure, not just green energy plants, but carbon sequestration plants, and possibly even facilities that would release materials into the stratosphere that would cool the earth down. So before we go, Aron, if people want to learn more about you, where can they do it? Also, I understand that you're running for office, so maybe you'd like to talk a little about that.
Well, I don't know what I can say about that here. I am running for Texas State Senate District 2. People can check that out on aronra.org. And if they want to look into my activism otherwise, I have a YouTube channel, 144,000 subscribers. That's ARONRA. I'm currently president of Atheist Alliance of America, and I do all of my activism through patron support at patreon.com/ARONRA.
All right, well, that concludes the podcast. Goodbye to the internet.